This may sound a little bit strange, but I always need some concrete examples. In my science, we use a lot the technique of morphing to find out where subjects trace category boundaries. For example, you have an image of a lion and an image of a dog, and there are morphism algorithms, computer algorithms, that transform slowly the one into the other. Is this transformation algorithm a functor? And or is this completely naive?
It is, no, it's not naive. The categorical concepts are very flexible and they can be adapted to various situations, and this could be a morphism. This could be a functor between different categories. It depends on some details. There is a newly developing branch of mathematical physics, I would say, which is called categorification. When we try to translate old physical concepts, old structures, into the language of categories. This is rather a difficult task, but the results are very rewarding. And I think this also could be in this case. Categorification is called. It's rather a strange English word, but.
So following up on that last answer, could you give us an example in physics of a categorization that has been fruitful?
It is usually fruitful because it reveals some dependencies between structures which are so far unknown. It is difficult for now to give some example, but this morning I was reading a paper about the categorifications of non-commutative algebras, which are used in physics. So there are some papers constructing categorification of classical mechanics and things like that. So, for instance, dualities are very beautifully explained, and some higher order dualities, so to speak. It is very rewarding to look at that.
Thank you. And I was moved because I was a student of Pater Bochansky in Fribourg. I remember his lectures on analogy too. And I was wondering, is a metaphor an example of analogy and a function? I like the metaphor I am using in neurosciences that Ramon y Cajal, who was the founder of neuroanatomy, said that the neurons were the butterflies of the soul. This is a metaphor. But at time we didn't see neurons moving like butterflies, but today we can see the axon moving, etc. And I think that the metaphor could be a good example, a linguistic example of an analogy. What do you think about that?
Usually people think that metaphor is something more poetic, and when we speak about analogy, we try, at least in philosophy, to make it more precise. Well, there is a lot of literature in philosophy of science about metaphors in science.
Yes.
So it's a huge field. I would say that perhaps with the help of category theory of some sophisticated logic, you could be able to formalize the concept of metaphor, but you should not go too far because you would kill a lot of poetry and good literature.
Thank you.
That's only a short comment.
Yeah, I have several remarks. One to Professor Phillips about examples of categorification in physics. Just a week before I came here, there was a talk at my seminar in Bonn. It was made by Professor Serganova, my former student. She's now a professor at Berkeley, and the talk was called "The Categorification of Boson-Fermion Correspondence." So about metaphor. There is a series of papers and maybe even a book by Lakoff dedicated to mathematical interpretation of metaphors. Like he is explaining that when we speak about the marriage or love as a metaphor, as a way, then we should divide these notions into several parts, love one way, another, and to make a correspondence between parts, so it is approximately something like that. And finally, I want to propose my own metaphor analogy. Let's consider the following situation. We know that in the Western culture, if a person wants to bring flowers to, say, if a man wants to bring flowers to a woman whom he loves, so he buys or collects something like several roses or several tulips, or maybe several roses and several tulips, wraps everything together and then brings it. Now, in Japan, there is a culture of ikebana, and as I learned from a professor who is from Japan and who taught with me in Northwestern, he taught theater no and ikebana. And I learned from him what I did not know, that actually ikebana is an art of structurizing whatever. You can take dry branches of birch. It's not necessary to be roses or something like that. But you can produce from them a structural object which will have all main characteristics of ikebana, whereas the Western bunches of flowers do not have any of these characteristics. Now, this is the first part. The second part, when we mathematicians are trying to explain what we are thinking, usually we choose one of two ways. We either try to explain what kind of objects we are thinking about, as maybe numbers, or in more sophisticated cases, sets, or maybe groups of symmetry, for example, or maybe even integrals. On the other hand, this is analog of Western way. On the other hand, people who are interested in what sometimes is called foundations of mathematics, they are interested in the ways we are thinking about these objects, whatever objects are. And this is ikebana-like way of thinking. And of course, actually, we need both. But what I want to say is that I draw here an analogy between Western bouquets and Eastern ikebanas and two ways of thinking about mathematics. And this is a functor, or whatever you think about it. Thanks.
Thank you. There is nothing to answer, just to thanks.